For those who love uncovering mysteries, Top 10 Secret is here to take you into a world of chilling and haunting tales. In today's video, we'll explore the top 10 creepy haunted hallway stories. Spine-tingling, terrifying, and unforgettable. Are you ready to step into the dark and mysterious? Stay tuned until the end so you won't miss a single detail. Story 1. The Haunted Corridor. The dilapidated red house lay deep within the forest of a forgotten rural village. Hundreds of years ago, it was the grand mansion of the curse-bearer family, a lineage rumored to conduct dark rituals. The curse began when the lone heir of the family offered the blood and flesh of their own kin to summon a mysterious entity from the shadows. Since that day, locals claim to hear screams echoing through the night, shadowy figures flickering in the corridors, and glowing golden eyes in the darkness, said to be the mark of a demon. Anyone who dared enter the house never returned. David, a curious and adventurous young man from America, was determined to confront the fear that had haunted him for years. In his possession was a journal left behind by his grandfather, the only known survivor of the cursed house. The journal recounted eerie sounds from nowhere, strange smoke rising from the floors, and, most hauntingly, golden eyes that never blinked. The house loomed before David. Its front door hung ajar, the rotting wood gaping like a mouth inviting him in. David stepped inside, finding himself in a seemingly endless corridor. The carpet beneath his feet was faded and torn, reeking of decay. Darkness enveloped the space ahead, the faint creak of hinges breaking the silence. He heard a rhythmic knocking from within the walls, as though something, or someone, was trying to claw their way out. David pressed his hand against the wall, feeling a cold, damp texture that resembled clammy flesh. Then, a face emerged. Golden eyes burned like fire, illuminating a grotesque grin. Laughter echoed, otherworldly and hollow. David turned and ran, but the corridor stretched on endlessly, the shadows growing thicker, suffocating him. Escape was no longer an option. A dusty staircase descended into the basement, its shadows pulling David down. The air turned icy as he entered the cavernous space below. Symbols etched into stone slabs glowed faintly, radiating an oppressive energy. In the center of the room was an altar, surrounded by extinguished candles and faintly glowing embers. David approached cautiously. On the altar lay an ancient book bound in heavy chains. As he touched it, a chilling wind swept through the room, and shadowy figures began to move in the darkness. The grotesque face reappeared, closer now, its golden eyes searing into his soul. "You have come too far. There is no turning back," whispered a voice that seemed to come from everywhere. David gripped the book, and instantly the embers flared into flames, illuminating the room in a fiery glow. He realized the curse's secret was before him, but he knew the price of uncovering it would not come easily. When David opened the book, ancient characters written in blood appeared on the pages. A deafening scream filled the room as the basement door slammed shut. David glanced around in horror as the shadows coalesced into humanoid forms creeping toward him. "You have chosen death for deliverance," the voice thundered. Before David could react, an icy hand clamped around his throat. He looked up to see the grotesque face inches away, its golden eyes blazing like twin abysses. Finally, David surrendered, swallowed by darkness and the haunting echoes of malevolent laughter. The following day, locals who wandered near the house discovered David's journal lying in the doorway. But of David, there was no trace. The house returned to its eerie silence, patiently waiting for its next victim. Story 2. The Dark Doll. In a forgotten village deep within the forest, there was a legend about a strange doll. The villagers called it the Dark Doll. No one knew where it came from, but rumors said it was the cursed spirit of a girl who had died a tragic death many years ago. 50 years ago, there was a girl named Annabelle who lived in the village. She was an odd child, always wearing a black cloak and painting eerie patterns on her face. Adults avoided her, and children mocked her, calling her the Little Witch. One fateful day, the children played a cruel prank, locking Annabelle inside an abandoned cellar overnight. That night, a violent storm swept through the village, causing the cellar to collapse and bury Annabelle alive. 3 days later, her body was found. Strangely, her face showed no sign of fear. Instead, it bore a chilling smile, her wide-open eyes staring blankly at the villagers. Her grieving mother, consumed by anguish and rage, cursed the village, declaring that no one involved in Annabelle's death would ever find peace. A year after Annabelle's death, strange occurrences began to plague the village. At first, faint laughter echoed through the night. Then, one by one, the children responsible for her death began to vanish. Each time someone disappeared, a doll resembling Annabelle would appear on their doorstep. The doll's face was painted like Annabelle's, with hollow, piercing eyes that seemed to watch every move. Sarah was a newcomer to the village, her family having moved there long after the tragic events. She had heard whispers of the dark doll, but dismissed them as mere superstition. One day, while cleaning the attic of her new home, Sarah discovered a peculiar doll wrapped in a black cloth. Its face was painted in eerie patterns, and its lifeless eyes seemed to follow her every move. She felt uneasy and decided to throw the doll away. That night, however, strange things began to happen. She heard faint footsteps echoing in the hallways, though she lived alone. The lights flickered erratically, and a child's voice whispered, "You found me, didn't you?" Terrified, Sarah searched for the doll, but it was no longer where she had left it. The next morning, a neighbor came to visit and found Sarah's door wide open. Sarah was nowhere to be found. On the kitchen table, the doll sat upright, its hollow eyes staring blankly ahead. The villagers believed Annabelle's spirit lived within the dolls, seeking out victims to drag into the darkness with her. The black cloak became a symbol of her sorrow and vengeance. No one knew when or how the curse would end, but they knew that once the doll appeared, someone would inevitably vanish. A month later, the doll reappeared, this time at the village square. Its face now bore an even more sinister expression, as though it was mocking the villagers. Desperate, the villagers decided to burn the doll, believing this might finally end the curse. They gathered in the dead of night, lighting a large bonfire. As the flames consumed the doll, a piercing scream erupted, shaking the very ground beneath them. Shadows writhed within the flames, forming the unmistakable silhouette of Annabelle. The fire suddenly extinguished itself, plunging the square into darkness. When the villagers relit their torches, they found a chilling sight. Dozens of identical dolls scattered across the square, each bearing Annabelle's painted face. The villagers panicked, fleeing back to their homes, but it was too late. That night, the entire village was engulfed in whispers, footsteps, and sinister laughter. By dawn, the village was silent. A traveler passing through found the houses abandoned, doors swinging open in the wind. On the doorstep of each home sat a single doll, its painted face a haunting reminder of the curse. To this day, the forest where the village once stood is avoided by all. Those who dare venture too close claim to hear faint laughter and see flickering shadows. Some even report finding a doll wrapped in a black cloth, its painted eyes staring at them. The legend of the dark doll lives on, an eternal warning of the price of cruelty and vengeance. Story 3. Eyes in the Darkness. The residents of Blackwood had long whispered of an ancient curse haunting the Shadow Hollow forest on the outskirts of their town. The forest was perpetually shrouded in dense mist and suffocating darkness, even on the brightest of days. They spoke of an ancient entity that dwelled within, a shadowy figure with glowing white eyes like blades, always waiting to devour anyone foolish enough to enter its domain. Most dismissed the story as a legend, a bedtime tale to scare children. But those who had lost loved ones to the forest knew the truth. Something lurked in the darkness, and it was always watching. That night, Emily, a young woman in the town, decided to do the unthinkable. 2 weeks ago, her younger brother, Jack, had disappeared into the forest while foraging for mushrooms. Search efforts had failed, and the townsfolk whispered that Jack had fallen victim to the stalker in the shadows. Unwilling to accept it, Emily pushed aside her fear, armed herself with an old flashlight and a small knife, and stepped into the deadly forest. The deeper she ventured, the colder the air became. The smell of damp earth and decay filled her nostrils, and the towering trees seemed to swallow the beam of her flashlight. The rustling leaves overhead and the creaking of brittle branches gave Emily the unnerving sense that she was being watched. But she pushed the thoughts away. "Jack!" she shouted. Only silence answered her call. After an hour of wandering, Emily stumbled upon an enormous tree, far larger than any she'd ever seen. Its gnarled bark was covered in deep claw-like gouges, as if some beast had attacked it repeatedly. But what froze her in her tracks was a scrap of red fabric snagged on one of the low branches. A piece of Jack's shirt. Her heart clenched as she shone her flashlight higher into the tree and saw 2 glowing white eyes staring back at her. She screamed and stumbled backward. The shadow began to move, slithering down the tree like a massive spider. It was a tall, thin figure with long, matted hair draped over its body like seaweed clinging to a rock. Its glowing eyes never blinked, staring at her with an intensity that seemed to drain the very life out of her. Emily trembled, but her voice rose in a desperate cry. "Where is Jack? What have you done to him?" The creature did not answer. Instead, a faint, chilling voice whispered behind her, "Emily, help me." She spun around to see Jack, but it wasn't the Jack she knew. He stood there, pale as a corpse, his skin waxy and lifeless, his hollow eyes void of any soul. "Jack, is that you?" Emily stammered, tears streaming down her face. Jack smiled. But it wasn't a human smile. It stretched unnaturally wide, splitting his face almost to his ears. Then he began to laugh, a high-pitched, grotesque giggle that echoed through the trees. Before Emily could move, the shadow from the tree was suddenly behind her. Its elongated, clawed arms wrapped around her body, dragging her closer to the enormous trunk. Emily screamed and thrashed, but her cries were swallowed by the darkness. In her final moments, she saw Jack's hollow eyes one last time, watching her with that eerie, unbroken smile. His voice lingered in her ears. "You'll stay with me forever now." The next morning, townsfolk discovered bloodstains on the ground beneath the massive tree, but Emily and Jack were nowhere to be found. The only thing left was the tree itself, and it had changed. Its bark now bore 2 grotesque, twisted faces, their mouths agape in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. Many believed it was the spirits of Emily and Jack, forever trapped within the cursed tree. But it didn't end there. From that day onward, anyone who dared to enter the forest never returned. The townsfolk whispered that on moonless nights, the tree would whisper through the wind, "Help me, Emily ... and glowing white eyes would peer out from the shadows, watching anyone foolish enough to cross into the forest's boundaries. No one escapes the darkness. No one outruns the gaze of it. Remember, if you hear faint laughter or see glowing white eyes in the night, run as fast as you can. But the truth is, you'll never escape, because the darkness has chosen you." Story 4. The Queen of the Darkness. The legend of the Queen of the Darkness has haunted the village of Eldermore for centuries. No one knows her true origins, but anyone who has ever seen the woman with demonic horns and eyes as black as the abyss has never returned to tell their tale. It is said that on moonless, rainy nights, if you step into the gloomwood forest and hear faint laughter amidst the mist, it's a sign that you have been chosen. And once you've been chosen, there's no escaping your fate. On one stormy night, Nathan, a young man from the village, decided to challenge the curse. He didn't believe in the folklore passed down by his parents and the other villagers. Nathan was stubborn, convinced that all the stories were baseless superstition. "I'll prove to everyone that there's no queen of the darkness," he declared boldly to his friends. Armed with only an old flashlight and a small knife, he ventured into the ominous gloomwood forest. As he delved deeper into the forest, the sound of the rain seemed to vanish, swallowed by an eerie, unnatural silence. The towering trees loomed above him, their twisted roots like hands reaching out to ensnare him. At first, Nathan wasn't afraid, but the further he went, the stronger the unease grew. His flashlight began to flicker. The cold wind whipped around him, carrying faint whispers he couldn't understand. Then he heard it, a faint laugh, soft yet piercing, like a needle driving into his ears. Nathan froze, straining to listen. "Who's there?" he shouted. No answer came, but he could feel invisible eyes staring at him from the shadows. And then he saw her. A woman stood under an enormous tree, her horns curling high above her head, her drenched black hair clinging to her haunting face. Her eyes were twin voids, absorbing all light and reflecting none. The tattoos covering her body were vivid and disturbing, especially the snarling beast inked across her chest, which seemed almost alive. Nathan froze in place. The woman smiled, her black lips curling in a chilling, otherworldly grin. Her voice, deep and echoing, sounded as though it came from another dimension. "You have entered my domain." Nathan turned and bolted, but his legs felt like they were sinking into the earth. Roots and branches suddenly burst from the ground, wrapping around his ankles and dragging him back. The woman began to approach, her dark eyes blazing like infernal flames. Rain poured down in torrents, yet Nathan felt as though his entire body was being consumed by fire. He tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. She leaned down, her cold breath grazing his ear as she whispered, "You will become part of me." The tattoos on her skin began to writhe, the monstrous figures breaking free and slithering toward Nathan. They wrapped around him, their claws and fangs tearing at his essence. In his final moments, Nathan saw himself being pulled into her body, his soul becoming yet another image inked on her skin. The next morning, villagers found Nathan's flashlight at the edge of the gloomwood forest, still faintly flickering. But Nathan himself was nowhere to be found. One brave soul ventured into the forest to search for him, but quickly returned, pale and trembling. He claimed to have seen something horrifying. Carved into the enormous tree in the forest was a new face. Nathan's face, frozen in an eternal scream of terror. From that day on, every time someone went missing, a new tattoo would appear on the Queen's body. A living, breathing image of their torment. The Queen was not merely a creature, but a collector of souls, feeding on an insatiable hunger. The villagers say that if you hear laughter on a rainy night, don't look back. Don't stop walking. But the truth is, once she has seen you, there's no way out. Remember this. If you ever see a woman with horns and eyes as black as the void, do not fight. Because from that moment, you are already hers, forever. Story 5. The Card of Death. There's an ancient legend whispered among gamblers, a chilling story that only those who dare to tempt fate in the dark world of luck can understand. The Card of Death. It's not just an ordinary playing card, but a curse, a sentence that seals your fate. Once the burning ace of diamonds appears in your hand, you don't just lose your money, you lose your soul. And when it appears, the dealer of darkness himself, Death, comes to collect his debt. Jake, a notorious gambler full of arrogance, always believed no one and nothing could beat him. But his belief was about to be shattered. That night, Jake entered a secret underground casino hidden in the crumbling outskirts of the city. It was a strange place, unmarked and shrouded in eerie silence, illuminated only by dim, flickering lights. The atmosphere was suffocatingly dark, but the promise of big winnings lured Jake in. The gambling table stood in the center of the room, surrounded by a heavy air of dread. The dealer was a tall, gaunt man clad in a long black cloak, his face concealed beneath the shadow of his hood. The other players around the table sat motionless, their expressions blank, like puppets waiting for someone to pull their strings. Jake sat down confidently. The dealer's hollow eyes seemed to pierce through him as the man gave a faint smile, revealing unnaturally white teeth. "Welcome, Jake," he rasped, his voice brittle like cracking bones. "This will be your final game." Jake smirked, his bravado intact. "We'll see about that," he said, scooping up the deck. "Let's play." The game began. At first, it seemed like any other hand, but Jake couldn't shake the unease creeping over him. The cards felt different. The designs on them shifted as though they were alive, writhing in his hands. He brushed it off, focusing on the game. But then the dealer slowly flipped over the last card, the Ace of Diamonds. The card was unlike any Jake had ever seen. Its edges were charred, and in the center was an image of a hooded skeleton, holding a flaming card in its bony fingers. As soon as the card hit the table, the entire room seemed to freeze. The air grew heavy, the flickering lights extinguished, and the card itself ignited in a ghostly flame. A low, bone-chilling laugh echoed through the room. Jake looked up, his heart pounding in his chest. The dealer had removed his hood, revealing a bare skull, its eye sockets filled with blazing fire. "Death, ... Jake whispered, his voice trembling. "Yes," the dealer hissed, "and you've been chosen. Did you think you could cheat fate? Now let me show you the price." The cards on the table began to rise into the air, spinning wildly around Jake like a whirlwind of blades. The figures on the cards twisted and transformed, their faces turning into grotesque visages of anguish, screaming silently. Jake tried to stand and run, but his legs were rooted to the ground. Skeletal hands emerged from the shadows behind him, gripping his shoulders and pulling him backward. "You'll become part of the game forever," Death whispered, his voice like a cold wind in Jake's ear. Jake's screams were swallowed by the void as Death plunged the burning ace of diamonds into his chest. An excruciating fire erupted from within, consuming him from the inside out. His skin cracked and peeled away, revealing charred bones beneath. But the worst was yet to come. His soul was pulled into the card, joining the countless others trapped within. In his final moments, Jake saw his face imprinted on the card, frozen in eternal terror, his hollow eyes staring back at him. The next morning, a cleaning crew found the casino completely empty. There were no signs of life, no sounds of the usual bustling crowd, just a single card left on the table. It was the Ace of Diamonds, its edges burned and blackened. When one of the workers picked it up, she froze. The face on the card was unmistakable. It was Jake, his mouth open in a silent scream, his eyes wide with horror. Since that night, the casino disappeared, but the legend of the Card of Death continued to spread. Gamblers whisper of its curse, warning each other to be wary of the burning ace of diamonds. If it appears in a deck, leave immediately. Never touch it. Never draw it. Because death is always watching, always waiting for a new soul to claim. And if you're unfortunate enough to hear faint laughter behind you as you play, don't turn around. But the truth is, by then, it's already too late. Death always wins. And his game never ends. Story 6. The Curse of the Flesh Ripper. The village of Raven's Hollow has long been shrouded in darkness, haunted by a chilling legend. The tale tells of a monstrous creature called the Flesh Ripper, a being cursed for eternity. It is said to dwell deep within the Blackthorn Forest, a place so dark that even sunlight dares not pierce its canopy. Anyone foolish enough to enter without permission never returns. Its glowing red eyes are the last thing you'll ever see, and its guttural growl is the dirge that accompanies your soul's departure. Michael was a young, arrogant man who laughed at the tales of the villagers. "There's no such thing as monsters," he scoffed. "It's just a way to scare people from exploring the forest." One cold, misty night, Michael decided to venture into Blackthorn Forest to prove that the Flesh Ripper was nothing but a myth. Armed with a flashlight and a small knife, he plunged into the suffocating darkness. The trees loomed above him, their twisted branches resembling clawed hands reaching for him. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the air became. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself wanted to pull him under. A foul stench hit him, a mix of decay and rot. It was so overwhelming that Michael gagged. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying voices he couldn't understand. He stopped and spun around, shining his flashlight into the shadows. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice echoing. Only silence answered. And then he saw it. Two glowing red eyes pierced through the darkness, locking onto him like burning coals. When Michael shone his flashlight in its direction, he froze in terror. The creature that emerged from the shadows was not human. Its flesh was torn and rotting, revealing sinewy muscle and veins that pulsed with a black, tar-like liquid. Its twisted face was a grotesque patchwork of ripped skin, and its mouth was filled with jagged teeth dripping with fresh blood. It didn't roar. It laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down Michael's spine. Michael's legs trembled, and for the first time, fear gripped his heart. The creature began to move, its heavy, deliberate steps shaking the ground beneath him. Its eyes burned brighter, searing into his very soul. Michael turned and ran, his heart pounding like a war drum. He crashed through the underbrush, branches slicing at his face and arms. Behind him, the sound of heavy footfalls grew louder, closer. The creature was chasing him, and it was fast, much faster than he expected. Its laugh echoed through the forest, a haunting melody of death. Michael tripped over a gnarled root and fell face first into the mud. He scrambled to his feet, but before he could run, the creature was there. It loomed over him, its massive form blocking out what little light remained. Its breath was hot and rancid, and it spoke in a voice that sounded like 1,000 tortured souls. "You should not have come here." Michael tried to back away, but the creature reached out with its skeletal clawed hand and grabbed his leg. Its claws tore into his flesh, dragging him closer. Blood soaked the ground as Michael screamed in agony, the sound swallowed by the oppressive darkness. He thrashed and kicked, but the creature's grip was unyielding. It lifted him effortlessly, bringing its horrific face mere inches from his own. Its eyes glowed brighter, and Michael felt an unbearable pull, as if his very soul was being ripped from his body. The creature opened its grotesque mouth, and Michael's screams were drowned out by the sound of his soul being devoured. He watched, helpless, as his own essence was consumed by the endless void within the creature. The next morning, the villagers of Raven's Hollow found a blood trail leading deep into Blackthorn Forest. But there was no sign of Michael. No body, no belongings. At the edge of the forest, they found a massive tree with bark that appeared to have been violently torn. Etched into the surface of the tree was a face, Michael's face. His features were twisted in an expression of pure terror, his eyes wide as if frozen in the moment of his death. From that day forward, no one dared to step foot in Blackthorn Forest. Those who ventured too close claimed to hear heavy footsteps and the chilling sound of laughter echoing from within. Some swore they could see glowing red eyes watching them from the shadows. And then, one by one, people began to disappear. Each time, a new face would appear etched into the trees of the forest, their expressions contorted in fear. The Flesh Ripper's hunger is unending, and every soul it claims becomes another voice in its chorus of agony. If you hear footsteps behind you in the darkness, or the sound of ragged breathing, don't stop to look back. But the truth is, you can't escape. Once the Flesh Ripper has seen you, your fate is sealed. The darkness is always hungry. And once it chooses you, there is no salvation. Story 7. The Smiling Doll. In a small, remote village, people often whispered about a cursed doll known as the Smiling Doll. It wasn't just an ordinary toy, but a sinister entity with an eerie beauty. Two-toned white and black hair, a pale, intricately painted face, and glittering eyes that seemed alive. Its smile, wide and unnervingly permanent, was said to carry a curse. Anyone who brought the doll home would experience unimaginable horrors. The smile wasn't just a decoration. It was a silent warning of the doom that awaited Lila. A young woman with a fascination for antiques stumbled upon the doll at a dusty old shop. Sitting on a shelf among cracked porcelain and rusted trinkets, the doll stood out with its haunting features. Its mismatched hair, dark makeup, and unnervingly wide smile captivated Lila. The shopkeeper, an old man with sunken eyes, warned her, "Do not take it home. That doll is not meant for the living." But Lila, entranced by its strange charm, ignored the warning. "It's just a doll," she laughed, paying for it and taking it home. From the moment the doll entered her house, the atmosphere changed. At first it was subtle, a feeling of being watched, of shadows moving where they shouldn't. Each morning, the doll would appear in different places. Sometimes it was on the bookshelf. Other times, it sat at the dining table as if waiting for her. Lila brushed it off as her own forgetfulness. But then, the noises started. At night, she would hear faint giggles echoing through the house. Whispers followed, calling her name. Lila. Lila. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. But the voices grew louder, clearer, until one night, she swore she heard someone standing right behind her. One night, Lila woke up to the sound of soft laughter. Groggy and disoriented, she reached for the light switch, but the bulb flickered and died. In the faint moonlight streaming through the window, she saw the doll. It wasn't on the shelf anymore. It was standing upright in the middle of the room, staring directly at her. Its wide smile seemed even larger now, and its glittering eyes gleamed in the darkness. "Let's play, Lila," the doll said, its voice sweet but cold as ice. Lila screamed and bolted from the bed, but the door wouldn't budge. The shadows in the room began to move, slithering across the walls and floor like living creatures. The doll giggled, its voice overlapping with others, like a chorus of tortured souls. "Run, Lila. Run if you can," it whispered. The door finally burst open, but instead of her familiar hallway, Lila was greeted by a never-ending corridor, dark and cold. She could hear the pattering of small feet behind her, the doll's laughter growing louder. "You can't escape me," it teased. She sprinted down the hall, but the darkness seemed to stretch forever. The air grew colder, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She tripped and fell, and as she scrambled to her feet, she turned to see the doll standing mere inches away. Its face was twisted into an impossibly wide smile, its painted lips now cracked and oozing black liquid. Lila collapsed to the ground, trembling. The doll towered over her, its delicate hands now sharp claws. "Did you think you could run from me?" it whispered, tilting its head unnaturally. Its eyes began to glow brighter, and its smile stretched even further. The shadows around them came alive, wrapping themselves around Lila's arms and legs. She tried to scream, but the darkness filled her throat, silencing her. The doll leaned closer, its icy breath brushing against her face. "Now, you belong to me," it said, its voice shifting into a deep, guttural growl. Lila's body froze as she felt something cold and sharp pierce her chest. The doll's claws weren't just ripping her flesh, they were tearing her soul apart. Every memory, every emotion, every shred of who she was being sucked into the doll's glowing eyes. Her vision blurred, and the last thing she saw was her own reflection in the doll's eyes, twisted, broken, and screaming. The next morning, Lila was gone. Her house was empty, except for the doll sitting neatly on the bed. Its face now bore a new detail. The eyes and smile had changed, resembling Lila's own. After that day, no one dared to enter Lila's house. But on moonless nights, villagers claimed to hear faint laughter and whispers coming from within. Those brave enough to peek through the windows reported seeing the doll sitting perfectly still, its smile wider than ever. And sometimes, if you looked closely, you could see its eyes shift, watching you. Over time, rumors spread that anyone who saw the doll and made eye contact with it would be cursed. Some disappeared without a trace. Others were found in their homes, frozen in terror, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. Each time, the doll would bear a new feature. A smile, a pair of eyes, a scar, each one stolen from its latest victim. If you ever come across a doll with a haunting smile and glittering eyes, remember, don't look at it, and don't take it home. Once the doll chooses you, there's no escaping. Its smile is not just a greeting, it's a gateway to your doom. And once it has you, you'll be part of its smile forever. Story 8. The Burning Black Rose. The legend of the Burning Black Rose has haunted the minds of those living near the Blackthorn Forest for centuries. A place where no sunlight can pierce through the dense canopy of trees. It is said that these roses are not ordinary flowers, but rather gateways to death and eternal torment. Their jet-black petals blaze with an eerie fire that never consumes them. And anyone who dares to touch one is doomed to face unspeakable horrors. Many have ventured into the forest out of curiosity or greed to find the fabled roses, but none have ever returned. The only remnants of their existence are the whispers carried on the wind, mournful cries of lost souls trapped within the forest's darkness. Evelyn, a young botanist with an insatiable curiosity for rare flora, became obsessed with the legend of the burning black rose. Despite warnings from friends and villagers, she was determined to uncover the truth. One overcast evening, armed with a lantern, notebook, and a small knife, Evelyn entered the foreboding Blackthorn Forest. As she ventured deeper, the light from the sky faded, replaced by an oppressive darkness. The air grew cold, and an eerie silence enveloped her, broken only by the crunching of leaves underfoot. Evelyn felt as though the forest itself was watching her, its ancient eyes locked onto her every move. After hours of wandering, Evelyn stumbled upon a clearing. At the center of the open space stood two black roses, their petals shimmering in the faint light of their ghostly flames. The fire danced delicately, casting flickering shadows across the ground, yet the roses remained intact, untouched by the blaze. Evelyn froze in awe. The roses were as beautiful as they were otherworldly, and she felt an inexplicable pull toward them. Slowly, she stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's just a plant," she whispered, reaching out to touch one of the petals. The moment her fingers grazed the petal, the flame erupted, engulfing her hand in a fiery blaze. Evelyn screamed, expecting pain, but instead, her hand felt ice cold. The fire spread up her arm like serpents made of frost, and whispers filled the air around her. Hundreds of voices murmuring, crying, screaming. Visions flashed through her mind. Twisted faces, eyes wide with terror, mouths frozen in silent screams. These were the souls of those who had touched the roses before her, their agony preserved within the petals. "You have been chosen." A deep, cold voice resonated from the flames. Evelyn tried to pull away, but her body refused to move. The flames tightened around her, anchoring her in place. The clearing transformed before her eyes. The trees twisted and contorted, their branches becoming skeletal hands reaching for her. The sky above turned a blood red, and the ground beneath her feet cracked open, releasing waves of icy fog. From the shadows emerged ghostly figures, distorted humans with hollow eyes and gaunt faces. They surrounded Evelyn, whispering, "Save us. Please save us." These were the lost souls of those who had been trapped by the roses, forever bound to their curse. A towering figure stepped out from the darkness. It was a monstrous being, its form shrouded in shadow except for its burning red eyes and long skeletal arms covered in ash. Evelyn realized it was the guardian of the roses, an ancient entity tasked with maintaining their curse. "Your soul will become one with the flame," it growled, its voice echoing like 1,000 tortured screams. Evelyn screamed as the fire consumed her entirely. She felt her skin crack and peel away, her flesh dissolving into ash. But the fire didn't stop at her body. It tore into her very soul, shredding it into fragments. Her memories, her voice, her essence, all were sucked into the petals of the roses. When the flames finally subsided, Evelyn was gone. In her place, a third black rose stood, its fire burning brighter and fiercer than the others. When the villagers gathered the courage to search for Evelyn, all they found was an empty clearing. In the center stood 3 black roses, their ghostly flames flickering ominously. The third rose seemed to glow with an intensity that hadn't been there before. From that day forward, the blackthorn forest became even more treacherous. Those who ventured into its depths disappeared without a trace, and each disappearance brought forth a new rose. At night, villagers claimed to hear whispers and mournful cries coming from the forest, as though the trapped souls were begging for release. But no one could save them. The burning black roses remained, eternally hungry for new souls to claim. If you ever find yourself standing before a burning black rose, remember this: do not touch it. Do not go near it. For once the rose has chosen you, there is no escape. The fire is insatiable, and it will burn until it consumes everything you are. You will become the next flame. Story 9. The Garden of Death's Roses. Deep within the shadowy blackthorn forest, where sunlight dares not reach, lies a place no one dares to enter. The Garden of Death's Roses. This is no ordinary garden. The roses there are said to bloom with a sinister beauty. nourished by the blood and souls of those foolish enough to enter. The black petals glisten like obsidian, and the roses burn with an unholy fire that never consumes them, instead devouring the essence of their victims. At the center of the garden lies a human skull, encased in thorny vines and surrounded by the largest, fiercest flaming black roses. Legend says that whoever dares to touch the skull will not only lose their life, but also be cursed to have their soul imprisoned within the garden forever. Marcus, an adventurer and collector of ancient artifacts, heard tales of the Garden of Death's roses in old folklore. The stories spoke of the skull at the garden's heart, containing a power that surpassed life and death itself. Despite the warnings of villagers, Marcus was undeterred. To him, the tales were nothing more than exaggerated myths meant to scare off the superstitious. One moonless night, Marcus entered Blackthorn Forest armed with a flashlight, a dagger, and unshakable confidence. The forest greeted him with an unnatural silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, only a suffocating stillness. The deeper he ventured, the colder the air grew, and a palpable weight seemed to press on his chest. He felt as if unseen eyes were watching him, following every step. The trees, their gnarled branches twisted like claws, seemed alive. But Marcus pressed on, determined. After hours of trekking, he stumbled into a clearing. Before him was a sight both mesmerizing and horrifying: the Garden of Death's roses. The black roses stood tall, their petals shimmering under the light of their ghostly flames. At the center of the garden was the skull, resting on a bed of thorns and encircled by the largest roses, their flames dancing higher than the rest. Marcus was captivated. Despite the oppressive atmosphere and faint whispers that seemed to echo in the air, he approached the skull, unable to resist its eerie allure. The moment Marcus touched the skull, everything changed. The flames on the roses flared wildly, casting the entire garden in a blood-red glow. The whispers grew louder, morphing into screams and haunting laughter that reverberated around him. Marcus froze as the ground beneath him trembled. The skull in his hands began to glow, and from its hollow sockets came a deep, guttural voice. "You have awakened the garden, and now you belong to it." Marcus tried to release the skull, but his hands were paralyzed, as if fused to the bone. Thorny vines from the surrounding roses began slithering toward him, wrapping around his ankles and wrists. They pierced his flesh, drawing blood, which seeped into the soil and seemed to feed the roses. Their flames burned brighter, as if consuming his very essence. "No, this isn't real," Marcus screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the cries of tormented souls. Skeletons began to rise from the earth, their hollow eye sockets glowing faintly as they surrounded him. "You will replace me," the voice from the skull continued, "and the garden will forever feast on your soul." Marcus felt his body being pulled toward the earth. The vines tightened their grip, digging deeper into his flesh as they dragged him downward. The fire spread from the roses to his body, not burning his skin but scorching his soul. He could feel his very essence being torn apart, piece by piece, as his memories, fears, and humanity were ripped away. The skeletons around him began to laugh, a grotesque, hollow sound. Their laughter grew louder as they pointed at him, mocking his futile struggle. One by one, they stepped back into the shadows, leaving Marcus alone with the burning roses and the ever-tightening vines. The last thing Marcus saw before the darkness claimed him was a new black rose sprouting from the ground where he had stood. Its petals glistened in the crimson glow, and its fire burned more fiercely than all the others. The villagers say that since that night, the forest became even more sinister. Those who dared to step into Blackthorn Forest never returned, and each disappearance was marked by the appearance of a new black rose in the garden. On quiet, moonless nights, the villagers claimed to hear faint screams and whispers emanating from deep within the forest. Some even say they've seen the garden from afar, its flames flickering in the darkness like the breath of a slumbering beast. They warn that if you ever find yourself near the Garden of Death's roses, turn back immediately. But beware. If the skull sees you, there is no escape. The flames will consume you, and you will become another soul trapped in the garden, your essence forever feeding its unholy beauty. Once you are claimed by the garden, there is no escape. Story 10. The Keeper's Curse. Deep within the Sahara Desert, where sand and time flow together in an endless tide, lies a forgotten tomb. Ancient texts speak of a burial site that doesn't just house priceless treasures, but also a sealed secret. The secret of an immortal entity known as the Keeper of the Curse. It's said that anyone who dares enter the tomb will face the cold silver eyes of the Keeper. Intruders don't die immediately. Instead, their souls are torn apart and forever imprisoned within the ancient inscriptions that cover the entity's binding wrappings. Dr. Elena Harper, a renowned archaeologist, was drawn to unsolved mysteries. When she discovered a map leading to the cursed tomb, she couldn't resist the lure of discovery. Ignoring the warnings of local villagers about the Keeper of the Curse, Elena assembled a small team and began her expedition into the heart of the desert. As they ventured deeper into the endless sands, strange signs began to appear. The dunes shifted unnaturally, forming ancient hieroglyphs that seemed to follow them. The wind carried eerie whispers, faint warnings to turn back. But Elena, driven by her obsession with unlocking the unknown, pressed on. After 3 grueling days in the desert, Elena and her team arrived at a massive stone door, adorned with bizarre carvings and hieroglyphs that shimmered like blood under the sun. As Elena touched the door, an icy chill ran down her spine, as though the tomb itself had come alive. The door creaked open, revealing a long, dark corridor. Torches lining the walls ignited on their own, casting flickering light on ancient, crumbling walls. At the end of the passage, they entered a vast chamber. In its center lay a stone altar, and atop it was a figure bound tightly in ancient wrappings covered in glowing inscriptions. The figure's eyes snapped open. They were not human eyes. They were twin pools of molten silver, deep and endless, piercing into Elena's very soul. A voice echoed, not through the air, but directly into her mind. "You have trespassed. The curse shall consume you." Before Elena could react, the ancient wrappings around the figure began to move. They slithered off the altar like living serpents, creeping across the floor toward her and the team. One of her companions screamed as the wrappings coiled around him, pulling him backward. In seconds, his body shriveled as the wrappings drained him of blood and life. His corpse crumbled into dust, and new inscriptions appeared on the wrappings, glowing as if freshly written. Elena tried to flee, but the heavy stone door had sealed behind them. The wrappings slithered toward her, hissing as they moved. The Keeper rose from the altar, towering and menacing. The glowing hieroglyphs on its bindings pulsed with a malevolent light, and its voice boomed. "I am the Keeper. Your soul will become part of my eternal script, your pain etched for the next intruder to see." The wrappings coiled around Elena's legs, pulling her toward the altar. She fought desperately, but the bindings tightened, piercing her skin. A freezing sensation spread through her body, and she felt her strength drain away. The Keeper loomed over her, its silver eyes burning with cold fury. "You cannot escape," it whispered. "Your existence is mine now." As the wrappings enveloped her, Elena's mind was flooded with visions, countless faces, screaming and writhing in torment, their souls trapped within the inscriptions. She realized these were the fates of those who had come before her, each of them a prisoner in the eternal curse. Her screams echoed through the chamber as her body was consumed. Piece by piece, her essence was torn apart. Her memories and emotions burned into the wrappings. Her physical form disintegrated, leaving only the faint glow of new hieroglyphs now added to the keeper's bindings. The keeper returned to the altar, its bindings once again still, waiting for the next victim. Villagers tell tales of the tomb, warning that those who venture too far into the Sahara on moonless nights might hear voices on the wind, whispers of the damned, crying out for salvation. But they also warn that if you hear the whispers, never follow them. For the keeper is always waiting, and once its silver eyes see you, there is no escape. Your soul will be torn from you, your pain immortalized in its cursed bindings, and your screams will echo in the tomb for eternity.